The chill of the marble floor still seems to seep into my bones, even now, years after I felt it last, the true, agonizing chill of that final moment. I remember the scent of expensive cologne mixed with the sharp tang of betrayal hanging heavy in the air of that penthouse suite, the city lights below looking distant and indifferent, much like the man standing over me. My rebirth, if you can call the violent, wrenching snap back through time that didn't come with trumpets or angels, just the suffocating terror of reliving the worst day of my life, except this time, I was armed with a memory so clear it felt like a fresh wound. I gasped, a ragged, desperate sound, and my eyes snapped open, not to the sterile white ceiling of the hospital room where I had finally succumbed to a broken heart and a failing liver in my previous life, but to the ornate, overly plush headboard of the guest room at the Sterling Manor. The sunlight slicing through the silk drapes was too bright, the air too fresh, and beneath my fingers, the sheets were smooth, cool Egyptian cotton, the exact kind that always made me feel utterly inadequate in the shadow of Elias Sterling. Elias. The name itself was a shard of glass in my throat. It was October 14th, 3 years ago. The day I had been utterly, spectacularly destroyed. The day he had looked at me, his face a mask of cold fury I thought I could never inspire, and announced loudly, for the benefit of his assembled business associates, that I was nothing more than a temporary distraction, a convenience he was now discarding like a crumpled receipt. I was 22 then, desperate for his approval, drunk on the intoxicating, poisonous illusion of his love. Now, standing here, my heart was not breaking, it was hardening, fusing into something cold, sharp, and utterly unbreakable. I pushed myself up, noting the silk nightgown clinging to my skin, another humiliating reminder of his casual ownership. I walked to the full-length mirror. The reflection staring back was the old me, slightly too thin, eyes wide with a yearning that bordered on pathetic, hair falling in soft, obedient waves. But the spirit behind those eyes was a stranger, a ghost seasoned by 3 years of grinding resentment and ruthless success. In my last life, I spent those 3 years trying to be the perfect companion, the quiet, supportive shadow, the woman Elias should have loved. I tried to emulate the glacial sophistication of his past lovers, the sharp wit of his current rivals, failing spectacularly at all of them, always falling short of the impossible standard set by his own icy perfection. When I finally died, I was an empty vessel, hollowed out by unreciprocated devotion. Now, the game had changed. I wasn't here to win his love, I was here to watch him fall, to carve out a space for myself so high above him that he would look up and choke on the dust of what he had thrown away. I moved with a deliberation that felt foreign yet perfectly natural. First, the wardrobe. I pulled out the flimsy dresses and soft pastels I used to wear to placate him. They were tossed onto the floor. I needed armor. I needed power. My past self had been ambitious, yes, but timidly so, hiding her brilliance for fear of eclipsing Elias. That was the first mistake I would never repeat. I had watched him build his empire from the ground up, seen the ruthless decisions he made, the deals he squeezed until they bled profit. I knew the weaknesses in his peripheral investments because I had spent countless late nights organizing his private ledgers, too loyal to see that I was actually perfecting the blueprint for my own future destruction. I needed capital, and I needed credibility, immediately. I slipped into the bathroom, the scent of his custom-made soap assaulting my senses. I ignored the impulse to splash my face with cold water. Instead, I pulled out the burner phone I somehow still possessed from a brief, forgotten venture before I was fully consumed by Elias, a secret I had kept even from my future self in that last life. It was charged, sitting in a small, hidden compartment in my jewelry box. A tiny seed of defiance I had forgotten. I didn't call my old mentor or a friend. I called the one person Elias despised, Marcus Thorne. Thorne was his chief rival, a man whose ruthlessness matched Elias's, but who possessed a raw, unfiltered cunning that Elias masked with polished veneer. The connection was slow, then a sharp, cynical voice answered. "Who is this?" "It's Anya Sharma," I said, my voice low, devoid of the tremor it always carried around Elias. "I have information regarding the upcoming Sino-American Trade Alliance deal. Information that will ensure Elias Sterling loses everything if he pushes forward with the current acquisition strategy." There was a beat of silence on the line, long enough for me to feel the familiar phantom weight of Elias's gaze on my back. "Anya." Thorn sounded genuinely stunned. "You're out of the Sterling camp. Why call me?" "Because, Mr. Thorn," I continued, walking to the window and looking out at the sprawling city Elias believed he owned, "I am no longer interested in standing in his shadow. I want to build my own light. And for that, I need a partner who understands that loyalty is negotiable when the prize is supremacy." The meeting was set for noon at a neutral, anonymous cafe downtown. I dressed in a severe, tailored suit I remembered buying for a charity gala I'd been dragged to, the dark charcoal cutting a sharp, unforgiving line. I wore minimal makeup, letting the severe cut of my hair and the cold fire in my eyes do the talking. When I walked into the cafe, Thorn was already waiting, radiating skeptical power. He looked me over, his gaze sweeping from my heels to my chin, searching for the naive girl who used to fetch Elias coffee. "You look different, Sharma," he admitted, leaning back. "More dangerous." "I learned from the best teacher," I replied, taking the seat opposite him without waiting for an invitation. Elias Sterling's primary error is his arrogance. He believes his intuition is infallible. He's heavily leveraged on the Meridian acquisition, banking on a swift regulatory approval that I know, through access I no longer have but recall perfectly, is being stalled by internal bureaucratic deadlock in Brussels. He's moving too fast, and is leaving his flank wide open regarding his holdings in the Singaporean tech sector. They're vulnerable to a hostile takeover, the timing is perfect for a short squeeze, and he's too distracted by Meridian to notice until it's too late. I laid out the strategy with the precision of a surgeon, using technical jargon that would have made my previous self blush with embarrassment. Thorn listened, leaning forward, his cynicism slowly melting into calculating greed. By the time I finished, he wasn't just interested, he was hungry. "This information is worth a fortune, Anya. What is your price?" he asked, his voice smooth. "A seat at the table, Mr. Thorn. Not as an assistant, not as a consultant, but as an equal partner in the resulting venture, provided we successfully bankrupt Sterling Global's primary holding company within 6 months. I want my own infrastructure built on the ashes of his empire. And I want Elias Sterling to personally witness my ascension before I deliver the final blow." Thorn smiled, a genuine, predatory expression. "You have your partner, Anya. Welcome to the dark side." The next few weeks were a blur of relentless activity. I slept 3 hours a night, fueled by black coffee and the sheer, electric thrill of self-determination. I liquidated what little personal assets I had left, funneled money through shell corporations Thorn provided, and began building a portfolio that mirrored, but ruthlessly countered, Elias's moves. The irony was suffocatingly sweet. I was using the intimate knowledge Elias had unwittingly given me to dismantle him. Then came the first inevitable collision. It was at the Sterling Tower Gala, an event I had always attended as Elias's silent, beautiful accessory. This time, I arrived alone, stepping out of a black town car that was noticeably sleeker, more expensive, than the usual fleet lining the curb. I wore a gown that wasn't designed to flatter, it was designed to dominate. Emerald green silk, cut sharply, emphasizing height and power rather than curves. The moment I stepped through the ballroom doors, the murmur of conversation faltered. Heads turned. They weren't looking at the usual array of socialites, they were looking at the woman who looked like she had swallowed the room's entire supply of ambition. And then I saw him. Elias Sterling. He was across the room, accepting congratulations, his dark suit impeccable, his jaw set with that familiar, unyielding pride. When his eyes swept over the crowd and locked onto mine, the effect was instantaneous and exactly what I had craved. He froze. The forced smile on his lips vanished. It wasn't recognition, not at first. It was confusion, quickly followed by a flicker of something akin to offense, as if my very presence, unbidden and undeniably successful, was a personal affront to his order. I didn't approach him. I walked straight to the bar, ordered a vintage champagne, one I knew he usually reserved for closing major deals, and turned my back to the entrance, letting the crowd ebb and flow around me, making myself an island of self-possession. I felt his approach before I saw him. The air shifted, the expensive scent of his cologne momentarily overpowering the ambient perfume. "Anya," he said, his voice low, roughened, stripped of its usual smooth command. He used my first name as if it were a physical imposition. I took a slow sip of my champagne, letting the bubbles tickle my tongue, pretending to examine the crystal flute. "Elias. Still dominating the local market, I presume?" My tone was polite, cool, and utterly devoid of warmth. He stepped closer, invading my space, a habit I used to crave, now merely irritating. "What are you doing here? And who are you arriving with? I haven't seen you in months." Months. I finally turned, offering him a smile that didn't touch my eyes. "We haven't spoken since. Well, since the last time you decided I wasn't worth the bother, I suppose. As for arriving, I'm here under my own auspices. I'm a patron now, Elias. You wouldn't recognize the entry requirements these days." His brow furrowed, that subtle tick that signaled deep irritation. "Patron of what?" "Anya, you're being deliberately obtuse. You look different." He gestured vaguely at my severe attire. "Where did this come from?" In my previous life, I would have stammered an excuse about finding a new passion or needing a new hobby. Now, I met his gaze steadily. It came from realizing that the only way to stop being scenery in someone else's masterpiece is to pick up the brush and paint your own. He visibly bristled. "Are you trying to imply something about my management of your future?" "No implication necessary," I stated clearly. "I'm stating a fact. I decided I didn't like the role you assigned me, so I resigned. Effective immediately, and retroactively, for 3 years. The crowd noticed the tension now, whispers starting to follow the Sterling name. Elias hated being the center of negative attention. His control fractured for a second. "You are being dramatic," he hissed under his breath, his hand tightening almost imperceptibly on the cuff of his jacket. "If you need money, I can arrange a stipend. Don't embarrass yourself." The word stipend struck the perfect, agonizing chord. In my last life, that was exactly how he viewed my entire existence, a subsidized hobby. I laughed, a short, sharp sound devoid of humor. "A stipend? Elias, darling, I came here tonight in a car that cost more than your entire executive bonus last quarter. I suggest you keep your charity for your failing subsidiaries. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to discuss the future of global infrastructure with Mr. Thorne. He values input more than looks." I pivoted away before he could form a coherent response, offering Thorne a gracious nod from across the room as I passed him. Elias stood there, rooted, watching me walk towards his greatest rival and suddenly, his greatest threat. That night was the first domino. Thorne and I were no longer tentative allies, we were a recognized power block. The buzz in the financial district turned from skepticism to outright alarm as our counter-moves began to strike Sterling Global's less visible assets. The next few months were a siege. Elias was brilliant, fighting back with the ferocity of a cornered beast. But he was fighting defensively, constantly reacting to my calculated strikes, whereas I was leveraging the future, attacking where he felt safest. I remembered every vulnerability. I knew his sleep schedule, his reliance on specific analysts, the exact moment he delegated control of the Asian markets when he was focused elsewhere. Every time he recovered from one blow, I delivered another, often through Thorne's established network, making sure the fingerprints pointed toward a massive, coordinated attack, never entirely tracing back to the quiet, disgraced ex-girlfriend. The hardest part wasn't the work, it was the proximity. We were constantly crossing paths at board meetings, industry mixers, and investor briefings. Each encounter was a masterclass in emotional self-mutilation. I had to look at the man who held the blueprint to my past misery, maintain eye contact, and discuss quarterly earnings projections with the same professional detachment I used with the janitorial staff. One evening, after a particularly brutal shareholder meeting where Elias was forced to publicly explain a staggering dip in valuation, I saw him alone in the executive parking garage. He looked older, the sharp edges of his youth worn down by stress. His tie was loose, his hair slightly disheveled, a sight that would have sent my past self rushing to offer comfort. I stopped 10 feet away, leaning against the pillar, watching him rub his temples with his thumb and forefinger. He didn't hear me approach, he just sensed my presence and looked up, his dark eyes filled with a dangerous exhaustion. Anya, he breathed, the name still laced with that possessive resentment. You enjoy this, don't you? Watching me bleed. Bleed. I tilted my head, a gesture of faux innocence. Elias, this is business. It's what you taught me to value. You always said sentimentality was the death of success. Perhaps you should have practiced what you preached. You used what I showed you against me, he accused, stepping towards me, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. You learned from me, and now you're trying to destroy me with my own lessons. You were a generous, if unwitting, tutor, I corrected him smoothly. But you made a critical mistake in your curriculum, Elias. You never taught me the value of loyalty to myself. You only taught me to be loyal to you. And that, my dear former mentor, was your ultimate oversight. He reached out, his hand hovering near my arm, a gesture that in the past would have sent sparks flying through me. Now, it just felt like a crude attempt at physical intimidation. I took a measured step back, breaking his reach. What do you want, Anya? He finally asked, the fight draining out of him, replaced by something raw and desperate. Money. A settlement. Thorn is running you ragged, he'll burn you once you've served your purpose. Thorn, I said, savoring the name, knows exactly what he's doing. And what I want is irrelevant to you now. What I have is what matters. And what I have is the dismantling of Sterling Global. I watched his face crumble as the reality of his situation finally settled in. He wasn't just losing a deal, he was losing the foundation of his entire legacy, the empire he had built through sheer force of will. And the architect of his downfall was the woman he had discarded like trash. Why? He managed, the single word heavy with 3 years of buried confusion. Why this scale of vengeance? I gave you everything you wanted. No, Elias, I said softly, leaning in slightly, allowing just a sliver of the old intimacy, the weaponized memory of it, to surface. You gave me what you thought I wanted. You gave me comfort, attention, jewelry, and a position next to you. But you never gave me respect. You never gave me partnership. You gave me a cage upholstered in velvet and called it love. And when you broke me, you shattered the illusion that I would ever settle for anything less than total autonomy. I left him there in the cold concrete, listening to the sound of his sharp, ragged breathing echo off the empty walls. The final stage was planned for the anniversary of the day I had been thrown out, the day I had died. Thorn and I had executed the hostile takeover perfectly. Sterling Global, the Titan, was teetering, its stocks plummeting as vital assets were being transferred to our newly formed conglomerate. Elias was facing SEC inquiries, furious board members, and the very public humiliation he dreaded most. I had orchestrated the final confrontation to take place in the very penthouse where my old life had ended. I didn't send a formal invitation. I simply showed up unannounced, flanked by 2 very large, very silent security personnel, walking past his terrified personal assistant as if I owned the key card. Elias was there, standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the city that was rapidly ceasing to be his dominion. He wore a crumpled shirt, unshaven, looking every bit the ruined king. Did you come to gloat, Anya? His voice was rough, devoid of ego. Just raw defeat. Gloat is such an ugly word, Elias. I prefer to call it presentation, I corrected, walking towards the large mahogany desk where I used to sit quietly, waiting for him to finish his work. I set a thick, leather-bound portfolio down with a decisive thud. This is the final offer from Thorn's consortium, I said, pulling back my chair and sitting down, gesturing for him to sit opposite me. He didn't move. We're buying the remaining shares at 10 cents on the dollar. If you sign, you walk away with enough liquid assets to start over somewhere small, anonymous. If you refuse, I let the implication hang in the air. Refusal meant bankruptcy, public ruin, and likely jail time for several questionable offshore maneuvers I had meticulously flagged for the authorities. He walked slowly to the desk, his eyes not on the contract, but on my face. You have become everything you claimed to hate. No, I countered, meeting his gaze. I became everything you needed me to be to survive in your world. I just learned to direct that survival instinct somewhere else." He looked at the contract, then at me, and a strange, almost frighteningly intense expression crossed his features. It wasn't anger, or fear, or even regret. It was a sudden, shattering clarity. "You never loved me," he stated, not as a question, but as a realization that had taken 3 years and the loss of his empire to finally comprehend. "Love." I allowed a small, genuine smile this time, though it was cold. "Elias, I was obsessed with the idea of you. The power, the prestige, the challenge. But you never saw me. You saw a mirror reflecting your own importance. You didn't love me, you collected me." He sank into the chair across from me, defeated. He picked up the pen, his hand trembling slightly, and signed the documents transferring control of Sterling Global. The sound of the pen scratching across the expensive paper was the sound of finality. "It's done," he whispered. I stood up, nodding to my security detail to collect the papers. I had won. I had achieved the revenge I had clawed my way back from the dead to execute. I should have felt triumphant, soaring. Instead, standing in the ruins of his empire, I felt empty. I turned to leave, walking towards the door, ready to step back into the life I had just purchased with 3 years of relentless effort. Wait. The single word stopped me dead in my tracks. It wasn't the commanding tone of Elias Sterling, CEO. It was the broken voice of Elias Sterling, stripped bare. I turned back slowly. He hadn't moved from the chair. He looked up at me, and for the first time since I returned, I saw something vulnerable in those dark eyes, not the calculated weakness he used to manipulate others, but true, unguarded devastation. "I understand why you did this," he said quietly. "And you were right. I was blind. Arrogant. I treated you like an extension of my own success, and when I grew bored, I discarded you." He paused, taking a shuddering breath. "But somewhere, Anya, amidst all the maneuvering and the backstabbing and the obsession with control, I started seeing you again. Not the girl who worshipped me, but the woman who dismantled me. And seeing that woman, seeing the sheer, terrifying strength you cultivated in my absence, it finally woke me up. I realized that the only thing I ever truly wanted, the only thing that ever grounded me, was the fierce, intelligent light you carry. I just spent years trying to extinguish it so I could control the darkness around it." He pushed himself up from the chair, not with the swagger of the CEO, but with the hesitant movement of a man learning to walk again. He approached me, stopping just short of the invisible boundary I had maintained for months. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I certainly don't deserve your love," he confessed, his voice raw. "But I am done with pride. I am done with the empire. It meant nothing without you defining the worth of the victory." He took a hesitant step closer, his eyes locked onto mine, pleading. He sank to one knee on the polished marble floor, right where I had woken up months earlier, right where I had felt the deepest shame of my first life. "Anya," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large, silent room. He didn't hold out a contract this time. He held out nothing but his honesty. "I have lost everything that mattered. Now, I am offering you the only thing I have left, the chance to rebuild, not on my terms, not as a prize, but as an equal. If you will have me, if you can ever find a way to forgive the ghost of the man I was, I will spend the rest of my life proving I can become the man you deserved 3 years ago." He didn't just kneel, he bowed his head, the gesture absolute, total surrender to the power I wielded over him now. The ruthless CEO, laid low, waiting for a verdict from the woman he had once mocked. The silence stretched, thick and heavy with the weight of 3 years of pain, strategy, and bitter, burning revenge. My heart, which I had so carefully forged into steel, gave a strange, unexpected lurch. The vengeance was complete. The slate was clean. And in the ashes of his empire, I saw not the satisfaction of victory, but a profound, terrifying vacuum. He was offering me everything I had wanted in the first timeline, only this time, it was real. It was earned not through submission, but through dominance. The price was steep, paid in the currency of his downfall. I looked down at the proud, ruined man kneeling before me. The ice that had encased my soul for so long began, agonizingly slowly, to crack. The story of revenge was over. The story of something far more complicated was just beginning. I lowered my gaze, watching the silhouette of his bowed head against the distant city lights, and for the first time, I didn't feel the cold. I felt the faint, terrifying warmth of possibility.